Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is a special edition of Nightline. As you may have heard by now, Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, has been shot and very gravely wounded. The incident only happened within the last few hours, and because of the importance of the event and its implications, we will spend the next half hour trying to piece together as quickly and as completely as we can what happened and what the effect of this attack is likely to be. First, what we know. Mrs. Gandhi was apparently shot at her home in New Delhi by two members of her own security guard. Reports are that she was shot 8 to 10 times with 4 bullets, striking her in the lower abdomen. The security guards who shot Mrs. Gandhi were reportedly members of India's Sikh minority. Both of them are said to have used a Sten gun, which is a British automatic rifle, in their attack, and were themselves then shot and killed by other security guards. We have a number of people standing by to help us sort through this story. We begin with Annabelle Hitchcock, who is a freelance reporter for ABC News. She joins us live via telephone from New Delhi. Annabelle, what can you add to what I've just said?
There are thousands of people gathered outside the All India Institute of Medical Sciences here in New Delhi, very anxiously waiting for word on the condition of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The police have communications vans all around. They have cordoned off the area. The police are armed with guns and rifles for crowd control. The police are very much involved also in cordoning off her residential area. And within the hospital itself, ABC News learned that spokesmen are not, doctors are not saying anything specifically about her condition. There have been a number of unconfirmed reports. All of them do indicate that she is very seriously hurt. There have been at least 8 bullets removed from her body, according to a number of different sources, primarily abdominal, some reports also of chest injuries and thigh injuries. So again, thousands of people very anxiously waiting around the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which is a very large and well-equipped hospital here in New Delhi, for word on the condition of Indira Gandhi.
Annabelle, what is the significance of the fact that her security guards, the ones who apparently shot her, were Sikh?
The army action that took place last June up in the Punjab, which Indira Gandhi ordered as Prime Minister, was very controversial. The army was sent in to remove terrorists and militant Sikhs from the premises of the Golden Temple, which is historically a very famous temple within the Sikh religion. The Sikh religion is a minority religion but has a large number of followers, I believe 10 million followers in India. And following that army action, in which hundreds of people were killed and a large number also of security forces who were involved in the operation, there have been a number of threats by Sikh militants against Mrs. Gandhi and against other Indian leaders as a retribution or reprisal, whatever, for this attack or operation, the Indian government calls it, on the Golden Temple to try to get the militants out of the temple and restore it to its regular functioning as a place of worship.
Annabelle, let me ask you to stand by for a moment, if you'd be kind enough. Joining us now from our London bureau is David Taylor, an Indian expert at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Mr. Taylor, first of all, there have been reports for some time of threats by Sikhs against Mrs. Gandhi. She must have taken those threats seriously. Analyze for us, if you would, the potential significance of what has happened here today. There has been violence in India many times in the past. Is this likely to lead to further violence?
Certainly it will lead to very great upheaval, and a great deal of violence might well flow from it, though I think not immediately from this particular assassination attempt or assassination. I think the possibility of retribution from Sikh extremists within the 10 million strong community was always a possibility, and the security forces must have been taking the most stringent steps against it. At the same time, Mrs. Gandhi had been trying to secure more of a political settlement, and in recent weeks it looked as though she was on the way to that.
Let me just interrupt for one moment to underscore the fact that Mrs. Gandhi, to the best of our knowledge, is still alive. She is reported to be in very critical condition. As we have heard, she has been shot at least 8 to 10 times. 4 of those bullets are said to have been in the lower abdomen. She is also believed to have some chest wounds. But let me ask you to sketch in for us a little bit, if you would, Mr. Taylor, the past few months and the tension in the Punjab, which is a northern state of India, where there is, I believe, a small Sikh majority. Is there not in that state?
That's correct, and for the last few years, the Punjab has been seen as the Sikh political base. And for a long time, that was a perfectly satisfactory situation. But from the late 1970s onwards, some leaders within the Sikh community, only some, were demanding a much greater degree of autonomy, almost up to the point of secession. And this was, naturally enough, being resisted by the central government. And a crescendo of attacks, assassinations, murders of Hindus, murders of Sikhs took place. The Golden Temple, the heart of the Sikh religion, was being used as a base by Bhindranwale, the main leader of the extremists, for these attacks. There were arms being stored there. And eventually, in June this year, the Indian army was sent in order to root out the extremists, and Bhindranwale himself was killed, and many of his followers also.
There has also been some activity around the Golden Temple during the past few weeks, has there not, with troops being sent to that area once more?
Well, troops have never been very far away from it, and troops were in occupation of the Golden Temple for some while. Then an agreement was reached by the government with the leaders of the religious leaders of the community for the troops to be withdrawn, and they were withdrawn, but the troops have never been very far away.
All right, if you'd be good enough to stand by, Mr. Taylor, we still have Annabelle Hitchcock standing by in New Delhi. When we return, we'll talk live with two other experts on India, Richard Sisson of UCLA and Ainslie Embree of Columbia University. Joining us live now in our Los Angeles bureau is Richard Sisson, a specialist on India and chairman of the Political Science Department at UCLA. In our New York studios, Ainslie Embree, cultural counselor at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi from 1978 to 1980, now chairman of the History Department at Columbia University. And of course, still with us in our London bureau, David Taylor, an Indian expert at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Mr. Embree, I come to you. Help us sketch in the role that Mrs. Gandhi has played over these last, my Lord, it's really been over the last 20-some-odd years, hasn't it, that she has been a major figure in Indian affairs. Sketch it in for us, would you?
Mrs. Gandhi came to power at a time when the previous Prime Minister had died. She was very much intended to hold the Congress Party together. Then in 1968 and 69, there was a split in the party. And since then, Mrs. Gandhi has sought to build up a strong base, not only in North India, which is her main base of power, but throughout the country. During the emergency, she became virtually dictator, then lost the election in 1977.
Which emergency are you talking about?
In 1975, Mrs. Gandhi declared what she called an emergency, in which she suspended a great deal of the conventional freedoms of the press and public access and free speech and so on. Her argument at that time was that there was a danger in the country of widespread violence and that it could only be curbed by strong government action.
Let me just interrupt you for a moment, because there may be people who are just tuning in, and I want to make clear what is going on to the best of our knowledge. Some hours ago, I believe it was at 11:10 Eastern Time here in this country, in New Delhi, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, was shot. Apparently, she was shot by two members of her own security guard who are members of India's Sikh minority. They, in turn, were shot by other security guards. There is said to have been a third Sikh police official who was involved and who has been arrested and is being interrogated. Mrs. Gandhi, meanwhile, very seriously injured. There are indeed some reports now that she may be in a coma, is in a hospital. Operations have already begun in an effort to remove the 4 bullets that went into her lower abdomen. She is also said to have been injured in the chest. All of that is going on right now. As soon as we hear anything new on that, we will, of course, inform you. What we're trying to do now is kind of sketch out the overall picture that exists in India today. And let me use that opportunity to ask you, Mr. Embree, that crisis, the one that you were referring to a moment ago in 1975, was that when there were indications that she was trying to hand over power to her son, Sanjay?
No, at that point, There had been a great deal of criticism for her because of activities in regard to an election. The opposition was led by an extraordinary figure from India's national movement, Jai Prakash Narayan. And her argument at that point was that there was a threat of violence throughout the country, a threat of disorder, but above all, the argument that India needed strong leadership, and it was for that reason that she called the, what she called the emergency.
And what happened thereafter? Now, she has been prime minister over the, as I say, over the past 20 years or so, on 4 separate occasions. Most recently, I think she was elected in 1980, was she not?
The very end of 1979, January 80, yes.
Let us take a look for a moment, Professor Sisson, perhaps you can help us in this regard, on what is likely to happen. I mean, it certainly seems that she is, at the very, very least, incapacitated, and it may be critical. Who is likely to take over? Her son?
This is crystal ball gazing. It's really unclear what would happen. The President of India would consult members of the majority party, which is the Congress I, the Congress Indira party, in Parliament, and see if there is a consensus leader. One of the, this is, of course, an enormous tragedy, and particularly so for Indian politics, given the fact that the 8th national election is anticipated to be held either towards the end of December or the first part of January, certainly by the 20th of January. The last elections, as Ainslie has mentioned, were held 5 years ago, and according to the electoral law of India, national elections are to be held no later than every 5 years, unless under special circumstances.
Gentlemen, forgive me. You must understand that most of us who are listening to you now have very little background on India, and I hope you'll be patient with us in terms of not allowing your explanations to get too arcane. The reason I made reference to Mrs. Gandhi's son, and of course this is not Sanjay. Sanjay died a couple of years ago. Her other son, Rajiv, is the General Secretary of the Congress Party. There have been some suggestions that he would be the logical one to succeed her. Am I incorrect in making that assumption?
No, you're not incorrect in making that assumption. Those have been the expectations that after the next elections, or certainly during her next term of office, if Mrs. Gandhi were returned, her party were returned in a majority, that Rajiv would succeed her as the prime minister. Whether or not that will prove to be the case is very uncertain. I would be reluctant to spin scenarios that would put any of a number of people as the next prime minister, or as prime minister at one time or another over the next few years. I would imagine that if Mrs. Gandhi has in fact been assassinated, that there would be a period of considerable instability, and as different groups within the Congress Party and also between the Congress Party and other opposition parties try to arrange a working coalition, a coalition that will demonstrate stability over some period of time.
All right, let me turn once again to Mr. Embree and address to you, Mr. Embree, the question that I posed to Mr. Taylor a few minutes ago, and that is the likelihood of further tension between the Sikh minority and Indian supporters of Mrs. Gandhi. What is the likelihood? There has been so much violence over the past year. Is there likely to be more?
I would assume so. What is extraordinary was that they had allowed 2 Sikhs to remain in her security force. Obviously, the point was they didn't want to say they distrusted all Sikhs. This is going to lead to a great deal of hostility towards the Sikh community from the majority Hindu community, at least in North India. Yes, I would expect there will be a great deal of hostility towards the Sikhs.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we will have a profile of Mrs. Gandhi. Let me just take a few seconds, first of all, to bring you up to date on what it is that has prompted this special program. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, 66 years old, was at her home this morning, actually Wednesday morning Indian time when apparently two of her bodyguards, both of them members of the Sikh minority, pulled Sten guns, which are small British automatic rifles, and fired them at Mrs. Gandhi, hitting her with an estimated 8 to 10 bullets. Those two men were themselves instantly shot and, we are told, killed by other security guards. Mrs. Gandhi was taken to a hospital. Operations have already been performed on her. She is said to be in very grave condition. Indeed, there are reports, unconfirmed I must add, that she has fallen into a coma. What we are doing now is to try to get some background, not only of Mrs. Gandhi, but also of what her incapacity is likely to do to India today. We will be talking to our live guests again in a moment, but first we have a profile of Indira Gandhi from ABC News correspondent Stephen Gear.
Indira Gandhi was born November 19, 1917. She is the daughter of Prime Minister Nehru, who guided India to independence from Great Britain, and she has been closely associated with Indian politics all her life. She is not related to the famed Indian leader, Mohandas Gandhi, who was a close friend of her father. She was married to Feroz Gandhi, also active in politics in India. When Nehru became the nation's first prime minister in 1947, Indira Gandhi became his official hostess and housekeeper. In 1959, she was elected president of the Congress Party, and she became prime minister in 1966. One of her first actions reversed one of her father's policies. She agreed to the creation of a separate state for the western Punjab's 7 million Sikhs. In 1977, she lost a re-election bid, but returned to the prime minister's post in 1980 and angered the Sikh population by her handling of Sikh violence in Punjab. Government troops besieged the Golden Temple, the Sikhs' holiest place of worship. Mrs. Gandhi's government said the siege was necessary to root out Sikh extremists who were waging a terrorist campaign. Her foreign policy has been centered on maintaining India's independence. In March of 1983, Mrs. Gandhi hosted a meeting of non-aligned nations and told the delegates the world was on the edge of a disaster.
Humankind is balancing on the brink of the collapse of the world economic system and annihilation through nuclear war.
In August 1982, Mrs. Gandhi visited the United States and on Nightline discussed India's relations with the United States with Ted Koppel.
Why is Indira Gandhi being so good to the United States again? There was a time when your feelings of coolness toward the United States seemed to overshadow your feeling of warmth. This trip seems to be a change of heart. Why?
I don't think that's true at all. I've never cooled off at any time. I've always wanted friendship and worked for friendship. I've always admired the American people, their dynamism, their vitality, and the talents which they attract from all over the world.
In an interview this month, Indira Gandhi said she did not fear assassination attempts. Stephen Gear, ABC News.
We're going to continue our discussion now with David Taylor, who is an expert on India from the University of London School of Oriental and African Affairs. Mr. Taylor, your projection of what this is likely to lead to now in the immediate days ahead and in the weeks and months ahead. This is a huge country, 750 million people, second largest country in the world, largest democracy in the world. What happens to it now?
I think in the short term, things won't be too bad, simply because of the strength of India's central institutions. I think the bureaucracy, the army, the police, the politicians on both sides of the political fence will come together to make sure that the damage is limited as far as it can be. But I think the longer-term consequences are much more serious, because these elections were the ones that were going to be held next month or the month after that, were going to be critical ones. If Mrs. Gandhi could come through them successfully, could demonstrate that she still has a hold on most of the country, then the transition probably to Rajiv would have been a simple one, and then he could have attempted to build up his own political base.
Her son.
Really, at the moment, he doesn't have enough political base of his own.
You were speaking of her son.
Her son, yes.
Now, who are the other major political figures on the scene right now? If you can give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of the two or three who would be likely to take over. She has been an extraordinary figure. As I mentioned earlier on, she's been prime minister 4 times, has really dominated the Indian political scene over the past 2 decades. Anyone there who could readily step into her shoes other than her son?
Not really. There are several major opposition figures. Charan Singh, the man who was Prime Minister for a brief period before she was in 1980, he's trying to project himself as the major opposition leader, but of course under present circumstances it would be inconceivable that an opposition leader could take over. And within the Congress party itself, there, apart from her son, there are really very few other solid political figures. There are one or two good politicians, people who can run the show. For example, the Home Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, could certainly take over for a short time, but he couldn't take over in the long run at all.
Let me interrupt you for just 1 second. And I emphasize this is only one news agency, but the French news agency Agence France Presse has just announced that Mrs. Gandhi is dead. That is their report. We have not had it confirmed. But it seems to me likely, it's an excellent news agency and they have very good sources in New Delhi. It seems to me likely that they know what they're talking about. And as we have been saying throughout this program, it seemed hard to imagine how a 66-year-old woman could sustain an attack with a Sten gun, be hit by 8 to 10 bullets and survive it. But Dr. Taylor, your final thoughts as we bring this program to a conclusion.
My final thoughts are that I'm utterly stunned by the event, and I find it very hard to think exactly which direction India is likely to move in, and I imagine that goes for virtually everybody in New Delhi and in India at the moment.
Well, let me use the last few seconds of this program then to extend our very deepest condolences to the Indian people. It appears, and I stress it appears, we have the report only from AFP, the Agence France Presse, that Mrs. Gandhi has been assassinated, that she is dead. I'll be back in a moment. One final word, the American wire services now confirm what we reported from AFP a moment ago. Mrs. Gandhi has died. There will be full coverage of the assassination attack on Indira Gandhi and reaction to it on World News this morning and on World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. That's our special report of Nightline for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This special report came to you from ABC News in Washington.